The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian and thank you very much for listening in again. We've another packed show for you, including a major interview with New Jersey-based Nancy du Tertre, who describes herself as a skeptical psychic. Nancy is a lawyer turned journalist and paranormal radio show host. Similar career path to mine. And in this wide-ranging interview, we discuss next-generation remote viewing, otherwise known as psychic spying, plus her various UFO and ET contact experiences, which have led Nancy to write a book using comparative linguistic analysis to examine spoken, written and telepathic extraterrestrial communications in documented contact cases. We also hear about her 10 years apprenticed to a well-known psychic detective, learning to be a psychic detective herself, and working with law enforcement on missing persons and homicide cases. And finally, Nancy also talks about her recent visit to Russia for 2 weeks of training in psychokinesis, that's moving objects with the mind, which she says proved weird and traumatic.
Normally the way people have described me is, I'm an attorney who became a psychic detective, remote viewer, trained medium, paranormal investigator, ufologist, author, lecturer, whatever you want to toss in.
Which prompts me to the first question is, how did you make this transition? Because presumably you, a bit like me, went to law school and thought you might have a legal career and then headed off in different directions. Is that how it went?
Yeah, I actually, once I graduated from college, I went into business for quite a while. And so I was kind of an entrepreneur, and I ran a bunch of businesses, including a healthcare industry newspaper. I was the editor and publisher of that. I was the owner-operator of a 242-bed skilled nursing home in Brooklyn, New York. I had a small printing company. I did a bunch of things, and then I decided to go back to school. So I went to law school, and I practiced securities litigation in New York for close to a decade, and then decided to go into our family business, which I ran the U.S. operations of our, we have it's a porcelain giftware factory in Limoges, France.
Right.
So I ran that for over a decade, and then I did a very sudden detour and got interested in intuition.
Right.
And after that, and I don't know how much you want me to explain of that.
No, well, yeah, explain a bit of it, yes.
Sure. I'm also trained in intuitive Gestalt psychotherapy. I did that for more than 20 years. Right. And the man who created that was somebody who I have a great deal of respect for. And he was supposed to really be the next Fritz Perls, the guy who created Gestalt psychotherapy. He's absolutely brilliant. He's very, very sensitive, and I couldn't understand why he wasn't writing his book. I had a dream about him, so I called him up, and I said, Ron, I had this dream about you. And he said, well, what were you dreaming? And I said, well, I dreamt that you were covered in mold. And I said, what do you mean mold? And I said, that green stuff. He said, well, why mold? And I said, because I think that you're not writing the great book about intuitive Gestalt psychotherapy that you ought to be writing. And I don't understand why not. So I would like to offer my services in whatever way, editing, proofreading, whatever, concept, bouncing ideas to help you write it. And he said, well, let me think about that. It's still early in the morning. And I didn't hear from him for a half a year. So I thought, well, that's silly. If he doesn't write this book about intuition, I'm going to have to write it, because clearly he's just not going to get around to writing it.
Yep.
And that started me on a quest to understand initially the psychology of intuition. And what I discovered was, at least at that time, psychologists, psychiatrists were absolutely not interested in intuition because it's outside of, in other words, once you acknowledge a source of intuitive knowledge, you're no longer in control. Mm-hmm. And in that client-patient dyad that they call it, the therapist is always guiding the client towards a particular resolution and using particular methodologies and using their authority. Once you acknowledge intuition, you're out of control. You've lost it. So they had absolutely no interest in it. I then studied a bunch of neuroscience. I thought maybe they could tell me something about the architecture of intuition in the brain. And they were worse, because intuition was such a subjective concept, or they seemed to view it that way. They went running away from it. Hard to measure, hard to identify, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And after that, I said, well, to heck with that. And I started interviewing anybody who could tell me anything at all about intuition, either how it works or how they experience it. So I began talking to these weird people who I'd never spoken with before, called psychics, mm-hmm. and mediums and medical intuitives and paranormal specialists, and then poker players and artists and alternative healthcare people, medical intuitives, whatever, you name it. And I was talking to anybody and everybody. And that was how I got involved in my initial training for close to a decade. I was apprenticed to a well-known psychic detective, mm-hmm. and, working with law enforcement and working on missing persons cases, and which are usually homicides, but not always.
Yeah.
And doing that. And then I branched off. I became a trained medium, a trained remote viewer, which is a form of what they call psychic spying. It was created by my mentor for the CIA back in 1973. So I trained in everything because I was not a natural psychic. I was brought up in a very academic family. Nobody ever said the word psychic. They thought psychiatry was kind of off the rails, so if you get any further than that, then you're really, you're lost.
Yeah. So
we never discussed anything like that. It was not acknowledged. I was not psychic as far as I was concerned. And I'm just a trained person. And once I realized that I could be trained, I realized anybody can be trained. And that's really been my main message.
That it's all down to training rather than being born with a specific gift.
You can be born, well, let me put it this way. And by the way, I've written a book called Psychic Intuition, Everything You Ever Wanted to Ask But Were Afraid to Know.
Right. And
I describe psychic intuition in terms of neuroscience, psychology, and linguistics, because all of those psychic ability is reflected in all of those fields. So there's a window of time that they talk about it a lot, and it's usually between the ages of about 3 and 6. And it's sort of, it's prelingual or almost prelingual. It's, people are just beginning to understand language and use it. It's usually, that's the age when they've suggested that most people are actually, that they have perfect pitch musically.
Right.
and that they begin to lose it after that. And same thing with psychic ability. Most people seem to have something that goes on around that age, and then they lose it. So the question is, why do they lose it? And then my answer is, it is lost because we are trained out of it. So the whole point is you got to train yourself back into it. We are trained primarily by virtue of language, which becomes the voice in our heads that becomes the voice of thinking. Think or speak something out in a train of thought. Train. Each wagon is connected.
Yeah.
Well, what you could do is you could start thinking holistically with your right brain. And once you start thinking holistically, which we do very naturally, and our brain does very naturally, and all kinds of brain studies, have shown this. It's quite astounding. Our right brain is pretty much superseded and crushed by our left brain. So we don't even realize that our right brain has those capabilities. But if you could do that, suddenly you can gather huge amounts of data. And you can train yourself to be consciously aware of them as you're experiencing them very, very rapidly.
Right.
But it's
gotcha.
a completely different way of thinking.
Okay. And
Did that answer your question?
it did indeed. It did indeed. Right. Now, tell me a bit more about the psychic detective work. Because, I mean, this is something that we've all seen in TV shows, but that's a TV show, and obviously it's got to be entertaining and fit within an hour. What exactly did you do, and how does it work, and is it actually effective?
Yeah, I mean, but, first of all, I would be the wrong person to ask to see if it's effective. The right people to ask would be either law enforcement or victims' families, and to see, what worked for them. There are lots of psychics out there who are more than happy to take full credit for having solved an entire crime all by themselves.
Yeah.
And I've never been a fan of that, and I don't think that most police departments are very happy about that either, because that's what they're paid to do.
Yeah.
Using government dollars. So, and on top of that, they're the people who have the skills, the expertise, and they're the ones sort of boots on the ground. They're the ones doing the actual investigations to find out whether anything that you said is actually accurate or not. So that being said, what I'm doing is I'm given a very limited amount of information, what you would call in remote viewing terms, you call it a slight front load.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I might be given the name of the person. I might be given the police flyer, which would indicate just the basics, like, physical description, age, the location where they were last seen, and maybe a photograph, something like that.
Yeah.
Or you may sit down with the police or the detectives in an office. They may hand you a photograph, or they may hand you an item that was owned by the victim.
Yeah.
And then what you're doing at that point is you are constructing a scenario about what you feel went on. And sometimes, and for me, it's always very different how I experience that. Sometimes that sort of comes in little chunks or clumps, like, words or terms or colors or sensations, and I don't know how to put them together. Other times they may come more as almost like a little miniature video or a little film or a movie, and you sort of see a fluid connecting type of an action of something happening or a location. And I never know how it's going to happen, but I will say that I've been able to locate on several occasions. The location, the exact locations, really exact, where that corresponded exactly where the police were, digging or dredging or looking for the body of a person presumed to be dead.
Mm-hmm.
I've been able to identify suspects and draw them in advance, confirmed by law enforcement, who would then sometimes drive me around to actually look at the suspects, which is a very creepy thing to do. Sometimes I've been able to come up with names or information about potential witnesses. So, all in all, I don't claim to have solved any cases, but I do believe that I have been able to contribute significantly towards the investigation.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately that's really what the whole purpose of a psychic getting involved in doing this kind of work is. You're helping the investigation, and you're usually doing it in a place where they've reached a dead end.
Hmm. And this goes back to what you were talking about with intuitive feelings, intuition.
Well, yeah, because in the way I've described this in my book, Psychic Intuition, is that the way some people think, oh, that crazy psychic stuff is it's either genetic or you're born with it. It's kind of wacko stuff. They're crazy people, but it's got nothing to do with true intuition, which we all understand.
Yeah.
And the way that I believe this operates is on a sliding scale with educated guesses on the conservative end, with gut feelings and hunches sort of in the middle on the emotional end, and then psychic ability on the more liberal end, which allows all kinds of other seemingly extraneous kind of data to get into your mind.
Yeah.
But it's a sliding scale that goes from, rational to irrational and from conscious to subconscious. And it involves all shades, flavors, variations of that combination.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is it's also why it can be trained.
And now, just sort of jumping back on some of the ideas we discussed by email beforehand, but one of the things you call yourself is the skeptical psychic.
I do.
Yes. Say a little bit more about that, because that's one of the things I think for a lot of people that puts people off, if you like, what we might broadly call the paranormal, is that some people see something and immediately think there is a paranormal, mysterious element to it, where others just think, well, no, that's just the way it is. We were discussing on the email, the people who take photographs and say, look, there are these mysterious orbs, whereas other people would take the same picture and say, you've got speckles of moisture on the lens, or those are just insects, or it's just the way of the sunlight. And it just seems that being skeptical and being a psychic is almost an oxymoron.
Yeah, isn't that fantastic? Well, let me preface this also. So in my family, I told you I grew up in a very academic family. My father was actually a very well-known medical scientist.
Yeah.
And actually he spent his sabbatical. I lived in England, in Cambridge, when I was a kid. So I got brought up with this idea that you sort of attack and examine everything from the point of view of logic. You analyze it and you try to match it up with anything in our consensus reality that you can.
Yeah.
Because that's how we all communicate, is through what we all agree upon in terms of our sensory inputs and also our conclusions about them. But okay, so to take your example about the orbs, I've taken, I can't tell you how many pictures of orbs, tons and tons and tons. And if you talk to people who are not very clear thinking, or they really want to believe in something, they will look at every single orb picture and say, oh my God, that's it's a spirit, it's a this, it's a that. It's paranormal. And I know for sure that that's just not the case.
Yeah.
Because you can take pictures, for example, I do lots of paranormal investigations. You can take pictures in very dusty basements, which are creepy and dark, but they're dusty, and any little speck of dust is going to create the illusion of an orb. Same thing, you point your camera lens, you'll get a flare. If you're pointing it at the sun too much, it'll look like an orb outdoors. Or, at night, if you're taking pictures outside, there are plenty of times you'll get insects. And strangely enough, mostly they're going to look like orbs.
Yes. So
I know that. So there are all kinds of rational. Oh, and also any type of humidity, rain, snow, anything like that. But, see, here's the other piece. I have also done enough of this work to know, and it has overcome a certain degree of, let's call it skepticism, that I might have had about any aspect of being paranormal about orbs, so that I now understand there is an aspect. And I'll give you 3 examples. First example, I went to hear a woman who is a sort of local celebrity spiritual medium. She's from New Jersey. And I went and I'm sitting in an audience, and I tend to be, all of my skeptical kind of, when people, particularly if they're speaking about, in generalities about people, like, give me some really good stuff that I can sink my teeth into. But the general stuff, nah. Anyway, so she was going around this huge room of maybe probably 300 people, a lot of people there.
Yeah.
And one by one, she'd sort of call out people in the audience, and she'd do readings about their deceased loved ones and whatever. And it was so-so. It was all right. It wasn't great. She gets around towards the very end, and she's speaking to, I think it was a woman who's about, 7 rows back. And I'm looking at her, and I'm looking at the woman, and all of a sudden, I see, all right, with my physical eyes.
Yeah.
I see what looks like a roughly 2-foot diameter golden, very pale golden orb descending. And the moment that it literally touches her face, this medium's face, she comes up with whatever it was, some incredible bit of information. Of course, I don't remember what it was, where the woman sort of immediately starts, sort of shrieks and starts crying. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that was.
Yeah.
Because I don't normally see those. That's first example. Second example, I go out to Nevada, and I'm out in Las Vegas, and I go out on sort of a little paranormal trip to, there's a biker bar sort of outside the city limits.
Yeah.
And it was known to be haunted, and it was known to be, there was a particular room where apparently there was some type of a, Wild West shootout, and sort of a famous guy from, I don't know, it was the 19th century or something, gets shot in that room, and it's known to be haunted since then. Yeah. Haunted, I didn't know how, I didn't know anything about it. So I spent a lot of time just sitting in that room, and I began to notice a very bright, and again, this is with my physical eyes, not my third eye, a bright blue orb, bright blue, sort of electric blue, I would say roughly 10 inches in diameter. And it's just floating through the room. So, of course, I grab my camera and I start snapping photos in the direction of where I'd seen it. That bright blue orb showed up in the photographs. And I do believe that was a spirit, possibly of that, whoever was haunting that room. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was able to verify it with something that was, it was exactly what I saw with my physical eyes. I saw it on the film. So that was good. Now I give you another example of an orb. This one is different. I was with my daughter in New Jersey. 5 minutes from our house, there's a movie theater that I've gone to for many, many years. And we were there, I believe it was on a Tuesday night, June 19th, 2011. I did not believe in UFOs because I had no experience, as far as I knew, with them.
Yeah.
I thought that was completely separate and apart from, any of this other stuff I was working on in the psychic and paranormal fields. So, strangely enough, there's nobody in the movie theater. Now, I've been here for almost 20 years. I'd never seen that before at the time. Well, it was a little over a decade at that time. There was nobody at all. And so we saw Woody Allen did a movie called Midnight in Paris, which is about going backwards in time, interestingly enough. And it was a decent movie. We come out of the movie theater, and there's not even an employee. I don't remember seeing a single employee there.
Yeah.
Which was also odd. We go out into the big parking lot, it's part of a big flat mall, so you have very good visibility of the sky. It was a very dark night. My daughter, as we get to the car, she points up in the sky. She said, "What's that?" And I look up and I see a mass of about 20 to 30 orange lights. Now, and they're just sitting there in the sky. They're about 500 to 1,000 feet above us. And I'm thinking, well, that's odd. You don't see orange lights. You see, blue, red, white, maybe green, but never orange. And the longer I looked at this, I began to realize it was a boomerang-shaped craft. You could make out the outline of it. And it was about the size of a football field. It was massive, and it was just sitting there. And my daughter was terrified. She said, "Let's go, let's go, let's go." And I said, "No, I have to see what this does." And of course, it didn't occur to me to pull out my phone and take a picture of it. I was just too mesmerized. And eventually, off of one of the tips of this boomerang-shaped sort of wing, a giant orb telescopes open. Like it starts small and just gets bigger, 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 until it was about the size, it was roughly 15 to 20 feet in diameter, by my estimation. It was huge.
Yeah.
And it was not like any other light I have ever seen in my life. And it certainly was not like any light that I've ever seen in the sky. It wasn't like the orange lights. It wasn't like lights you'd see on an airplane going by. It was not like the light of a star, which all have sort of beams or rays that come off of the object, of the light. There were no beams or rays. It was completely luminescent. It was uniform in brightness and self-enclosed. It detached. It started moving around the sky near the craft. It sort of did all kinds of loop-de-loops and went around. It went behind the craft, disappeared briefly, came back over the top of the craft, and then eventually redocked on the same wing, and then telescoped close in sort of a blink. It was very, very fast, and then it was gone. And then the entire craft, with all of its orange lights, either cloaked or dematerialized in 3 phases. The wingtips first, the center of the wings, and then the center. It did not fly away. So that's a different type of an orb. Those kinds of orbs, and by the way, and I don't know how much you're familiar with the field of UFOs, but those are actually quite common. And people have theorized about what they are. In many cases, they look like a form of some type of a craft, or an entity that is also a craft.
Yes.
But there's absolutely some form of intelligence associated with them.
Yeah.
And I don't claim to have many absolute answers about things. I have a lot of theories about things.
You've written a book, haven't you, about your UFO ET contact experiences on comparative linguistic analysis?
I did. And actually, I got started on that because of that experience, because for a year and a half after my daughter and I had that sighting, whenever she and I would get on the phone, I live in New Jersey. She lives in Brooklyn in New York.
Yeah.
And no matter what combination of phones, landlines or cell phones, we would, for a year and a half, something would interrupt our phone calls. And we could both hear this very peculiar, very cold, electronic sounding, sort of male sounding voice, very creepy sounding. But we couldn't talk to each other. We could only hear it. And it was speaking in some type of unknown language. It did say my daughter's name once. It wasn't anything like at least in the old days, you used to get third-party interference sometimes. Wires get crossed and you get into somebody else's conversation. It wasn't that. It was very deliberate, and whatever it was, it would speak in there were phrases, okay, so it did have some essence of language to it. And when it was done, it would simply hang up both of us simultaneously, and we would be unable to call each other back, usually for 5 to 10 minutes. And eventually it got to the point where it was doing this between my daughter and some of her friends, so they heard it. And between me and, in particular, one of my clients, who happens to be a very well-known psychotherapist, and she heard it, but it came in as a kind of weird, really weird music. I'm usually very good with words, and I don't really know how to describe that. I've tried to describe the sounds as something between what you would imagine a dinosaur shrieking or the sounds of giant canal locks closing, the big iron screeching noises, combined with celestial tubular bells and chimes, and gorgeous, but nothing. It didn't sound like anything I've ever heard. And it hung us up, of course. And my client, who couldn't get back in touch with me, emailed me and said, "What the hell was that? And whatever the hell that was not of this earth." So that launched me into this fascination with alien or ET languages. And I began to wonder, well, who else has heard these things? Turns out a lot of people have. And so when I wrote How to Talk to an Alien.
That's the name of the book.
Yeah, that's the name of the book.
Yeah.
I looked at lots of different documented cases where people were able to mention briefly or describe in whatever way they could the languages that were being communicated through these alleged aliens, okay, and whether it was spoken, written, or telepathic. And then I was able to kind of make several observations about all aspects of alien language. It's really difficult because you're dealing right up there on the edge of people's what you might call imagination, and trying to get, when you're dealing with a language, the whole concept is that there's a structure, and that it's a known structure, and that it operates to deliver at least a similar meaning to everybody. Of course, it's not going to be the same, but it'll be similar. And so when you're dealing with ET languages, it's really hard. I would talk to a lot of these contactees and say, well, okay, you've scribbled down these strange little signs and symbols and things. was your sense that did they represent letters? Well, no, not really. Okay, were they more like sort of ideograms or like Chinese calligraphy, where you have one symbol that represents almost an entire, either a concept or sometimes even a sentence, but it's all squished into one symbol. Sometimes they would say, yes, I feel like that symbol there represented this and that. And sometimes they couldn't even do that. I'd say, well, all right, well, if you put together all these symbols, what was the emotion that you were experiencing, the thought process, whatever it was, when you gathered this set of symbols?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they have an answer, and sometimes they don't, which makes it really difficult to examine sort of this. You're looking for a Rosetta Stone all the time, and it's really hard.
Have you been able to draw any conclusions from your research into, I suppose you'd call it ET linguistics?
Yeah, I mean, quite a few. First, I thought it was fascinating that many of them speak with accents. And you might say, well, so what? But as I've pointed out before, if you have, somebody from, let's say, I don't know, New England, somebody from Texas, somebody from England, and somebody from India, all speaking English.
Yeah. They will all have a different accent. Yes. Yeah.
They're all going to have a different accent, and you're going to know quite a bit about them just by virtue of their accent.
Yeah.
And the same is true if you look at aliens. And there was, and one of my favorite cases of that was there was a case in northern Italy, and this was in the 1950s. And of course, I'm going to forget it was called the Friendship Case. Excuse me. And there were some local villagers of this very small village, and they had gone to some local ruins, I think, and all of a sudden they encounter these very peculiar people. They look like people. They're sort of, I guess, some of them are giants, and I mean giants probably in the realm of, 8 feet tall.
Yeah.
And some of them look like dwarves, let's say 3 feet tall, in that realm.
Yeah.
It turns out and I'm really truncating this whole story, but it turns out that there was apparently an underground, 200-mile long underground base along the western coast of Italy underneath the Adriatic Sea, where these aliens had been existing. And they contacted not just the local villagers, it was a huge deal. They got the politicians from not just Italy, but all over Europe were involved in contact, major industrialists, academics, IT people, all kinds of, and they were all very aware of this particular group. And one of these aliens, apparently, he spoke with one of those, I always try to compare it in English. I don't speak any Italian. But it was, if you go back to, let's say, the 1930s, at least, I think, I don't know if they did this in England, but certainly, I mean, in America, in the films, if you listen to them, they would have a voice, and they would talk like this, and they would have a little bit sharp, a little bit nasal, and they had a certain aspect to the, the way that they would talk.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So one of these aliens apparently was speaking Italian kind of like that.
Yeah.
And they learned that particular alien had learned how to speak Italian by listening to old film reels of Mussolini.
Yeah.
So,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
So just the accent alone gives you data about the alien, namely that, well, first of all, they're studying, all right, and that they're listening to certain types of recordings, and that they are it's not their native language.
Yes.
But that they have the capacity to learn it. So you're just that little bit, you can gather a whole ton of data. Now, they may have learned it here on Earth, let's say in their base, or they may have learned it, let's say, in outer space. If they're traveling around, they're able to electronically gather recordings and information.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are many, many examples of people who have had contact with various types of ETs that they've heard different accents, and I won't do all of them, but the other thing that's interesting is that depending on the species of alien, okay, and the species is going to be, they'll all have different types of physical attributes, which may or may not include a mouth, vocal cords, ears, things like that. That some of them have no ability, apparently, to speak any human language, and others of them can speak literally hundreds of human languages, including, as I discovered, some of them been able to speak Finnish. And there are only 5 million people in the world who can actually speak Finnish. And apparently it's one of those incredibly difficult languages.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
So they have, differing capabilities, but they do communicate through language. And I've sort of gotten a lot of, I would say, skepticism from the contactee world, strangely enough, because they dismiss what I have to say about that, because they say, oh, well, we all know aliens only communicate telepathically. That is the ultimate universal language. And yeah, of course, many of them do. Many, of course. And I've experienced that myself. And I get that. Sometimes telepathic communication is done through what feels like an instantaneous overlay of pure information. Okay, and doesn't contain language.
Yeah.
Other times, it's done, if you really think about it, or you're waiting to see how it occurs, it's done through language. And what I discovered was that in some cases, they've actually made errors of language within telepathic communication to humans, which I think is fascinating, because that confirms that it's a form of language. Telepathy in that case is being done through a form of language.
Yeah. Yes.
So they're communicating in many, many, many different ways. Written, spoken, telepathic, body language, all of the above.
I'm conscious time is getting on, but one of the things you sent me a note about was you said you'd recently returned from Russia, where you'd done 2 weeks of training in psychokinesis. That's moving objects with the mind, which you then went on to say was proved both weird and traumatic. So tell us about that. I mean, that's got everything in it. Telekinesis, Russia, and it's weird. So how did that come about and what actually happened?
In some way, I'm still reviewing that every day.
Yeah.
It was, I went there with a friend of mine who I am so glad I went with her. She is an absolutely brilliant woman. She's an aerospace engineer. She's done, all kinds of very interesting work in her life. She's been a professor out in California. Very, very accomplished. She's basically taught herself 12 languages. She has some Russian heritage, speaks a little Russian, had been there, I think, lecturing as well as at various different conferences. So for her, it was her 4th time. For me, it was really, I had been there once before, but I was on a cruise and it was sort of quickie in and out of Russia.
Yeah.
But I was there for 2.5 weeks last August. I was there to learn specifically the Russian method for, as you say, telekinesis or psychokinesis, which is moving objects with the mind without touching them. And I already knew how to do that. I've been doing that for a few years, and I've been working with several physicists and also neuroscientists on this to try and sort of isolate the variables involved. One of my, this is sort of, it's a form of psychokinesis. I mean, you do things like, I mean, they sound silly and simple, but actually it's very fascinating, and it has, I think, potential, all kinds of applications, which I think has been heavily recognized by certainly the U.S. and Russia. You can do simple things like, put a little paper pinwheel or a metal pinwheel inside a container, an airtight container, and simply look at it and get it to move.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can do the same thing. What they did in Russia is they had us pretty much just working with paper spirals, which are suspended inside the equivalent of an upside-down glass vase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I've done stuff, and I'm sure you've heard of Uri Geller. I know.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Many people have, and doing spoon bending parties was something that was developed in the U.S. by Jack Houck, who taught about 17 or 18,000 people how to bend metal to varying degrees, usually, like a spoon or something like that. I've been able to bend steel rods, and what happens is they melt. It's the strangest thing in the world, and you can't believe that you did this. It's just weird. Same thing goes with these. When you can get spirals and things to respond to you, it's weird. It's weird because they're not living.
Yes. So
there's an entire other metaphysical question that goes on there. Anyway, my trip to Russia, it lasted 2.5 weeks. We were in training at an institute that was highly recommended through one of my physicist friends who had done training.
Yep.
And I went there with my friend, and almost all of our exercise involved physical training.
Yeah.
And it was painful from day one. I complained about the pain in my back. They paid no attention. They said, just keep doing it. And at a certain point, the director, after a week I was in severe pain. And I couldn't understand, why are we doing this and not, spinning things with our mind? Well, what's this about? And it was never explained, of course. We were not allowed to, we were basically imprisoned, let me put it that way, for 2 weeks. We were not allowed to go to the bathroom unless we had permission. We were locked in rooms, sometimes for many hours, without being told if anybody was coming back. We weren't really given meals to any, nothing consistent. And very little. And at one point, the director told me to do an energetic exercise to resolve my back pain, which she finally recognized after about 8 days. And her idea was to send white light out from the base of my spine out through the equivalent of the crown chakra, through the top of my head, and then to pull in what she called black light or black substance in through the crown chakra and send it all the way down through the spine to the base, and repeat that many, many times. And in retrospect, I think that was highly, highly, highly peculiar. Any healers, psychics, mediums, medical intuitives, anybody that I've ever talked to or worked with all over the world, and I know some of the top people in the world, they will tell you, you don't want to be working with the absence of light. darkness, negativity, negative energy. Why would you eliminate your white light, which is generally viewed for, something for protection and healing and all that kind of stuff, and be told to only draw in the lack of that. Anyway, my back is broken. I came home from my trip, and I discovered that I have, it's very serious. I have a broken bone in my lower back. I have, the disc is gone, sciatic pain as a result, and my entire spine is unstable. So I've been dealing with that, as that was sort of my parting gift. But as far as psychokinesis goes, by the end of the second week, where we were, and I won't go into all that, I'm working on something right now where I'm going to explain this a lot better.
Yeah.
I would walk into a room, and I would look at the little spirals, the paper spirals hanging, under glass, and they would all start spinning.
Yeah.
And I have a number of different theories about that.
Yeah.
And I think, I got what I wanted to know to some degree, although I think they were fairly cagey about it. Their method, the Russian method for doing psychokinesis, has a lot to do with physicality. They don't really talk about energy. They talk about substance and moving that substance, and also through a kind of rigid denial of all sense of time and control and freedom. I mean, I find it fascinating. The problem is that I don't need to go through a form of imprisonment in order to move objects with my mind.
Yes. Turning to the future, because we're just about to enter a new year, and it will be New Year when this show goes out, along with hopefully a full recovery with your back and pondering on your Russian psychokinesis experience. What other projects have you got in mind or planned?
Something that I am working on right now. Thank you for asking that. I have developed a style of remote viewing, which I said was sort of, I consider it next generation off of the more classical types of remote viewing that were developed during the Cold War as a form of psychic spying. It's what I call clairvoyance with protocols. You have very strict sets of rules in order to try to to perceive something that is remote in terms of space or time, or both. Mm-hmm. And I call this TSP. I'm setting up classes for that. I do teach that. I've had people from all different professional backgrounds tell me that it's been literally life-changing for them. They see things they've never seen. They have abilities they never knew they had, and they like it. So I'm doing that. I'm working on a book to talk about my Russian experience, and the usual.
You call it TSP. What does TSP stand for?
I find that fascinating that everybody, that's their first question. Not what is it, what does it do, is what does TSP stand for? So my stock answer is that it's a really, really bad acronym for tested ESP. TESP.
Right.
Of course, the easy way to look at it would be The Skeptical Psychic. And my website is theskepticalpsychic.com.
Yeah.
If people want to go there and find out about workshops, it's all done online. I teach people from all over the world. Or if they want to find out, I do also predictions. Yeah. I've been doing that for about a decade, and I post them publicly. I try to match them up with real-time events. There's another aspect of my being skeptical. I give readings. I do all kinds of things. Anyway, if anybody is interested, they can go to theskepticalpsychic.com.
Well, Nancy, I know you've got another appointment. So thank you very, very much for your time. Hope your back makes a good recovery, and look forward to, keeping in touch with you and, keep us posted on your new developments. And in the meantime, it just remains for me to say, have a great start to 2020.
Thank you so much. You too. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
And that's it. Time for me to go. But before I do, I have 2 words to say to you. TikTok. No, that's not the sound a clock makes, but TikTok, the rapidly growing social media platform, which is based on 15-second snips of video clips. Curiously, it is becoming a popular home for people interested in witchcraft. Currently, TikTok's witch hashtag has received over 585 million views, while Baby Witch, hashtag for those just getting into the craft, has 45 million, and Witches of TikTok has over 84 million views. Visit one of those hashtags and you'll encounter live stream tarot readings, spell tutorials and educational videos on crystals, candles and other aspects of magic. You'll also encounter lots of people with strange coloured hair, painful looking facial piercings and endless background music by Stevie Nicks. Apparently the big attraction of a TikTok, apart from the fact the clips are very short, in fact many appear to be too short to be of any practical value, is that its algorithms are more user-friendly and accessible than Instagram and Facebook. Anyway, it just remains for me to say thank you for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me again same time next week. Till then, this is Charles Christian saying goodbye, and I'm off now to download the TikTok app. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.